My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 78 years old, and for most of my life, I believed family came first, until my son taught me otherwise. They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what happens when your child puts a birthday cake above your broken heart? When my beloved Harold passed away last spring, I discovered exactly who my son had become. The boy I raised to value family chose his wife's party over his father's final goodbye. That decision cost him more than he ever imagined. Some might call me cruel for what I did next, but when you hear my story, you'll understand why I had no choice. Sometimes the hardest lessons require the strongest medicine, and sometimes a mother must break her own heart to save her child's soul. I was born Eleanor May Hutchinson in the small coastal town of Harbour Point, Maine, where the lighthouse still guides ships through foggy nights and everyone knows their neighbors' names. My father ran the local hardware store, and my mother taught piano lessons in our living room. The sound of scales and arpeggios was the soundtrack of my childhood, mixing with the distant cry of seagulls and the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocky shore. Life in Harbour Point was simple but good. We didn't have much money, but we had something more valuable: a tight-knit community where people looked out for each other. When Mrs. Gardner's husband died in a fishing accident, the whole town rallied to help her keep their bait shop running. When the Petersons' barn burned down, everyone showed up with hammers and nails to rebuild it. That's how I learned what family really meant. Not just blood relatives, but people who show up when life gets hard. I met Harold at a church social when I was 19. He'd just moved to town to work at the shipyard. A tall, quiet man with calloused hands and the gentlest brown eyes I'd ever seen. While other young men tried to impress the girls with loud jokes and fancy clothes, Harold simply offered to help clean up after the social. I watched him carefully stacking chairs and wiping down tables, and I knew right then he was different. Our courtship was old-fashioned, even by 1960s standards. Harold would walk me home from church, carrying my hymnal and making small talk about the weather and his work at the shipyard. He never presumed to hold my hand until our fifth walk, and when he finally did, his palm was sweaty with nervousness. "Miss Eleanor," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'd be honored if you'd allow me to court you properly." My father approved immediately. "That Harold Whitfield has a good head on his shoulders," he'd say, watching from the porch as Harold helped me tend my mother's garden. "Works hard, speaks honest, treats you with respect. Can't ask for more than that in a man." My mother agreed, especially after Harold fixed our temperamental oven without being asked and refused any payment except a slice of her apple pie. We married 2 years later in the small white church overlooking the harbour. It wasn't a fancy wedding. My dress was borrowed from my cousin, and the reception was potluck in the church basement. But it was perfect. Harold's hands shook as he placed a simple gold band on my finger, and when he said "I do," his voice cracked with emotion. Harold and I built our life together brick by brick, just like the small blue house we bought on Seafoam Lane. It needed work. The porch sagged, the kitchen was outdated, and the upstairs bathroom leaked when it rained. But it was ours. Harold would come home from the shipyard covered in grease and sweat, eat a quick dinner, then spend his evenings fixing one thing or another. I'd hold the flashlight while he worked under the sink, or hand him tools while he patched the roof, and we'd talk about our dreams for the future. "One day," Harold would say, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, "this place will be perfect. Just you wait and see, Ellie." He only called me Ellie when we were alone, and the way he said it made me feel like I was the most precious thing in his world, which, as he often told me, I was. We wanted children desperately. Every month I'd hope and pray, and every month I'd be disappointed. After 3 years of trying, we saw a specialist in Portland who delivered the news that my chances of conceiving were slim. I cried the entire drive home, Harold's hand steady on mine as he navigated the coastal roads. "We'll figure it out," he kept saying. "There's more than one way to build a family." And he was right. 2 years later, we adopted Thomas, a 6-month-old baby whose teenage mother couldn't care for him. The moment the social worker placed him in my arms, I understood what people meant by love at first sight. Thomas had a shock of dark hair and the most serious expression I'd ever seen on a baby. Like he was already contemplating life's big questions, Harold was instantly smitten. He'd rush home from work, not even stopping to wash his hands before scooping Thomas up and dancing him around the kitchen. "Did you miss your papa?" He'd coo, his rough shipyard voice going soft and silly. "Did you have adventures with Mama today?" Thomas would gurgle and grab at Harold's nose, and my heart would swell watching my 2 boys together. We gave Thomas everything we could. Not material things, we didn't have money for that, but time, attention, and unconditional love. Harold taught him to fish off the pier before he could properly walk, propping him up against a piling with a tiny rod in his chubby hands. I read to him every night, working my way through all the children's classics, and then moving on to adventure stories as he grew older. The community embraced Thomas as one of their own. Mrs. Chen from the market always slipped an extra cookie into our bag for him, and Captain Murphy let him ring the bell on his fishing boat whenever we walked past the docks. There was never any question that Thomas was our son, as real and beloved as if I'd carried him myself. As Thomas grew, so did his curiosity about the world. He was bright, scary bright, his teachers said. By 2nd grade, he was reading at a 5th grade level. By middle school, he was taking apart radios and putting them back together, explaining to Harold how the circuits worked. "This boy's going places," Harold would say with pride. "Mark my words, Ellie, our Thomas is destined for big things." We scrimped and saved for his education, putting aside money from Harold's overtime and my part-time job at the library. When Thomas won a partial scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, we were over the moon. "You go show them what a Harbor Point boy can do," Harold had said, clapping him on the shoulder the day we dropped him off at campus. Those early years with Thomas were the happiest of my life. Every milestone felt like a small miracle. His first word, boat, much to Harold's delight. His first day of school. His first caught fish. Our little blue house was filled with laughter and chaos. Thomas's toy boats cluttered the living room floor. His school projects covered the kitchen table, and his baseball glove always seemed to be left on the stairs where someone could trip over it. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. No matter how busy the week got, we'd gather around our old oak table for pot roast and mashed potatoes. Thomas would regale us with stories from school. Harold would share funny incidents from the shipyard, and I'd update them on the town gossip from my library shifts. "Mrs. Morrison's daughter is getting married," I'd report, passing the green beans. "To that fellow from Portland with the fancy car." Thomas would roll his eyes at small-town news, but he'd lean in just the same, eager for every detail. Harold was the kind of father every boy should have. Patient, steady, and endlessly encouraging. When Thomas struck out in Little League, Harold would practice with him in the backyard until the sun set. When Thomas struggled with geometry, Harold would sit at the kitchen table for hours, working through problems even though his own education had ended at high school. "You don't give up on family," Harold would say. "That's not what Whitfields do." The summer before Thomas left for college was bittersweet. We knew everything was about to change, but we tried to squeeze every moment of togetherness we could from those warm months. Harold took 2 weeks off work, the first real vacation he'd taken in years, and we rented a cabin by Moosehead Lake. We fished, hiked, played cards by lantern light, and talked until the stars came out. "I'm going to miss this," Thomas had said one night, roasting marshmallows over the campfire. "Miss you both." Harold reached over and ruffled his hair, something he'd done since Thomas was tiny. "We're not going anywhere, son. Harbor Point will always be home, and we'll always be here." I remember the way the firelight danced across their faces, both so similar in their quiet strength, and I thought my heart might burst with contentment. Thomas thrived at university. He called every Sunday without fail, his voice excited as he described his economics classes and the friends he was making. "There's so much to learn, Mom," he'd say, "about markets and international finance and investment strategies. It's like a whole world I never knew existed." Harold and I would exchange glances over the phone. This was territory neither of us understood, but we were proud of his enthusiasm. He came home every holiday, bringing laundry and textbooks and stories of campus life. The house would come alive again with his presence. He'd help Harold with repairs, accompany me to the library, visit his old teachers. Everyone in town wanted to hear about his adventures at the big university. Thomas was patient with their questions, but I could see something changing in him. A slight impatience with our slow coastal rhythms. A new way of checking his watch during conversations. Still, he was our Thomas. He'd sit on the porch with Harold, drinking beer and discussing the Red Sox. He'd help me prepare Thanksgiving dinner, peeling potatoes while I basted the turkey. He'd attend the Christmas Eve service at our little church, his strong voice joining the familiar hymns. "Some things shouldn't change," he'd say, hugging me goodnight. "I'm glad home is always home." Everything shifted when Thomas met Vivian Chen during his junior year. She was a business major from San Francisco, her family wealthy from real estate investments. Thomas's Sunday calls became filled with "Vivian thinks" and "Vivian says." When he brought her home for spring break, I tried to keep an open mind. After all, Harold and I had raised Thomas to judge people by their character, not their background. Vivian was beautiful, I'll give her that. Polished in a way that made our simple home seem shabby by comparison. She wore designer clothes and carried a purse that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. But it was her eyes that troubled me, calculating and cold even when she smiled. She looked at our house, our town, our life, like an appraiser estimating value. "This is quaint," she said, surveying our living room with its worn furniture and Harold's ship models. Very authentic coastal charm. The way she said authentic made it sound like we were a tourist attraction rather than a home. Thomas beamed at her approval, missing the condescension in her tone. Or perhaps choosing to miss it. Harold tried his best to welcome her. He showed her his workshop, explained his projects, even offered to take her out on his friend's fishing boat. Vivian declined with a shudder. "I get seasick," she explained. though I suspected it was more about the smell of fish and the possibility of getting her manicure dirty. Harold's face fell slightly, but he covered it with a smile. "Another time, then," he said kindly. The dinner conversation was painful. Vivian dominated it, talking about investment opportunities and market projections. When I mentioned my library work, she looked puzzled. "But surely that doesn't pay well?" she asked. "Why not get a job in the private sector?" I explained that I loved connecting people with books, helping children discover reading. She nodded politely, but clearly didn't understand choosing fulfillment over financial gain. Thomas seemed different around her. He laughed too loud at her jokes, agreed too quickly with her opinions. When she criticized the local restaurant where we took them for lunch, "Don't they have anything that isn't fried?" Thomas hurried to apologize for our provincial tastes. The boy who used to defend Harbour Point against any slight now seemed embarrassed by his roots. "She's interesting," Harold said carefully that night as we got ready for bed. "Different from us, but if she makes Thomas happy." He trailed off, and I could hear the doubt in his voice. We'd always trusted Thomas's judgment, but this felt like watching our son become someone we didn't recognize. After they left, the house felt unsettled. I found myself replaying conversations, wondering if I was being unfair. Maybe I was just a mother reluctant to let go. But when Thomas called the following Sunday, he mentioned they were looking at apartments together for after graduation. "Vivian knows all the best neighborhoods," he said. "She's got connections in investment banking. Says I'd be perfect for it." "What about your plan to teach economics?" I asked. Thomas had always talked about becoming a professor, sharing knowledge like his favorite instructors did. There was a pause. "Vivian says teaching is a waste of my potential. The real money is in finance." The real money? When had my son started measuring success in dollars? Harold noticed it too. "He didn't ask about the boat restoration," he said after one call. Thomas had always been fascinated by Harold's latest project, a vintage sailboat he was bringing back to life. Now he seemed to have forgotten it existed. Or worse, decided it wasn't worth remembering. The changes came gradually, like erosion wearing away at a cliff face. Thomas graduated summa cum laude, and we drove down for the ceremony, so proud we could barely contain ourselves. But at the reception afterward, Vivian introduced us to her parents as Thomas's adoptive parents from that fishing village in Maine. The emphasis on adoptive stung, as did the reduction of our beloved Harbour Point to that fishing village. Thomas got a job at a Manhattan investment firm, just as Vivian had orchestrated. They moved into a gleaming apartment that Thomas showed us through video calls. "Look at the view," he'd say, panning his phone across the skyline. "Isn't it incredible?" It was impressive, but I missed seeing his face during our conversations. Now, we competed with city lights for his attention. The Sunday calls became sporadic. "Sorry, Mom, we had a client dinner." Or Vivian planned a weekend in the Hamptons. Or simply, "Things are crazy at work." When he did call, the conversations felt rehearsed. He'd ask about the weather, Harold's health, my library programs. But I could hear him typing in the background, his attention divided. They got engaged the following Christmas. Thomas didn't ask Harold for his blessing, didn't include us in the proposal plans. We found out through a social media post. Vivian's hands sporting a massive diamond, the caption reading "Said yes to my future CEO." I stared at that photo, trying to find my son in the man grinning beside her. and felt like I was looking at a stranger. The wedding planning revealed how far we'd drifted. Vivian hired a coordinator who called to inform us of our role. We were to arrive 2 days before the ceremony, wear specific colors. Harold needed a new tuxedo that cost more than he'd ever spent on clothes, and were assigned seats that I discovered were not at the main family table. Space limitations, the coordinator explained briskly. Should we offer to help pay? Harold asked one evening, studying the elaborate invitation. Traditionally, the groom's family contributed, and we'd been saving for this moment. When I delicately brought it up with Thomas, he laughed. Don't worry about it, Mom. Vivian's family has it covered. They have very specific ideas about how things should be done. The message was clear. Our money, like our opinions, wasn't wanted. The wedding was a spectacle that felt more like a business merger than a celebration of love. 500 guests, most of whom Thomas had never mentioned. Ice sculptures, a 20-piece orchestra, food I couldn't pronounce. Harold and I sat at our assigned table with distant Chen relatives who spoke primarily Mandarin. We watched our son work the room like a politician, Vivian directing his movements with subtle gestures. During the father-son dance, which had been reduced to a brief formal moment before the real entertainment began, Harold tried to connect. "I'm proud of you, son," he said. Thomas smiled, but his eyes were already scanning the room. "Thanks, Dad." "Oh, there's Mr. Whitmore from Goldman Sachs. I should say hello." And he was gone, leaving Harold standing alone on the dance floor. After the wedding, we saw Thomas maybe twice a year. Thanksgiving was usually impossible. Vivian's family has traditions. Christmas was a brief overnight visit if we were lucky. They never came for Harold's birthday or our anniversary. The excuses piled up like snow. Big deals at work, social obligations, Vivian's charity events. Our son had become a guest star in his own family's life. The town noticed. "How's Thomas?" people would ask, and I'd cobble together updates from his infrequent texts. "Busy," became my standard response. You know how it is in the city. But I could see the pity in their eyes. Everyone knew Thomas had forgotten where he came from. Harold's health began declining in the fall of 2022. It started small. Shortness of breath climbing stairs, fatigue after simple tasks. Harold, stubborn as always, insisted he was fine. "Just getting old, Ellie," he'd say. But I knew better. After months of badgering, I finally got him to see Dr. Patterson, who had been our physician for 30 years. The tests revealed congestive heart failure. "We can manage it, Doctor," Patterson assured us. "But you need to slow down, Harold. No more heavy lifting, regular medication, plenty of rest." Harold nodded along, but I saw the defeat in his eyes. A man who'd worked with his hands all his life being told to sit still was like telling a bird not to fly. I called Thomas immediately. "Dad's sick," I said. No preamble needed. There was silence on the line, then the sound of shuffling papers. "How sick?" he asked. I explained the diagnosis, the treatments, the limitations. "I see," Thomas said. "Well, keep me updated. I'll try to visit soon." Try to visit. His father had heart failure, and he'd try to visit. Harold's condition worsened through the winter. The man who'd once carried 100-pound equipment at the shipyard now struggled to walk to the mailbox. I converted the dining room into a makeshift bedroom so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. Our days became structured around medication schedules and doctor visits. Yet Harold never complained, never asked why Thomas hadn't come. "He's busy, Ellie," Harold would say, when I'd rail about our absent son. Building his life. That's what we raised him to do. But I heard the hurt beneath the understanding. Harold had given everything to raise Thomas. And now, when he needed his son most, Thomas was too busy building his empire to visit his father. March brought a severe episode. Harold collapsed in the kitchen, his lips blue, gasping for air. The ambulance ride to the hospital was the longest journey of my life. As they wheeled him away, I called Thomas with shaking hands. This time, Vivian answered. "Eleanor," she said coolly. "Thomas is in a meeting. Is this urgent?" "His father's in the emergency room," I said through gritted teeth. "I'd say that's urgent." She sighed as if I'd inconvenienced her. "I'll let him know." Click. No questions about Harold's condition. No words of comfort. Just an annoyed sigh and a dial tone. Thomas called back 3 hours later. 3 hours while I sat alone in the waiting room, praying for my husband's life. "Mom, I'm sorry. Big presentation. How's Dad?" I wanted to scream at him, to demand how any presentation could matter more than his father's life. Instead, I calmly explained that Harold was stable but critical. They were admitting him for observation. "I'll book a flight," Thomas said. And for a moment, I felt relief. Finally. "When can you get here?" I asked. Another pause, keyboard clicking in the background. "Well, I need to wrap up this deal first. Maybe Thursday." It was Monday. His father was in critical condition, and he needed 3 days to wrap up a deal. Harold spent a week in the hospital. Thomas arrived on Friday, breezing in with expensive flowers and excuses. "Traffic from Boston was murder," he said, as if he hadn't had 5 days to make a 3-hour journey. He stayed for 2 hours, spending half of it on phone calls in the hallway. When he left, Harold smiled sadly. "At least he came," he said, and my heart broke for the man who was grateful for scraps of his son's attention. That was the pattern for Harold's final year. Health scares, hospital stays, and Thomas appearing briefly like a celebrity, making an obligatory appearance. Always checking his phone, always with somewhere else to be. The boy who'd once helped his father fix boats now couldn't spare an afternoon to simply sit with him. Harold passed away on April 15th, Tax Day, which he would have found ironically appropriate. "Even death comes with paperwork," he would have joked. But there was nothing funny about those final moments. I held his hand as he struggled for each breath, his eyes finding mine with such love and trust that I could barely breathe myself. "Tell Thomas," he whispered, but couldn't finish. "I will," I promised, though I didn't know what message he wanted delivered. Maybe just that his father had thought of him at the end, that despite everything, love remained. Harold squeezed my hand once more, and then my husband of 56 years was gone. I sat with him for an hour before calling the nurse. I needed the time to say goodbye properly, to thank him for our life together. When I finally made the calls, I started with Thomas. It was 7 a.m., but this couldn't wait. The phone rang 5 times before he answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Your father passed away this morning," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "He's gone, Thomas." Silence. Then, "Oh, just oh." Like I'd told him we were out of milk. "I'm sorry, Mom. How are you holding up?" How was I holding up? My world had ended, and he asked like it was small talk. "The funeral will be Monday," I said, ignoring his question. "At St. Mary's, 11 a.m. I'll need you to be a pallbearer." "Monday?" His voice sharpened, suddenly alert. "This Monday?" "Yes, Thomas. 4 days from now. Is that a problem? I knew I sounded harsh, but I was beyond caring about his schedule. It's just... Vivian's birthday is Monday. We have reservations at Le Bernardin, the private wine tasting she's been planning for months. I mean, of course, Dad's funeral is important, but couldn't we do it Tuesday instead? I held the phone away from my ear, staring at it like it had transformed into something alien. My son was asking to postpone his father's funeral for a wine tasting. Harold's body wasn't even cold, and Thomas was worried about restaurant reservations. Are you seriously asking me to reschedule your father's funeral for your wife's birthday party? I said each word slowly, distinctly, hoping I'd misunderstood. Not reschedule exactly, Thomas backpedaled. Just push it back one day. Vivian's already invited her family, and you know how her parents are about social obligations. They flew in from San Francisco. Your father is dead, Thomas. The words ripped from my throat. He's dead, and you're worried about disappointing your in-laws. Mom, please be reasonable. Dad's already gone. One more day won't matter to him. But Vivian's birthday, that's for the living. We can honor Dad and keep everyone happy if we just... I hung up. I couldn't listen to another word. My hands shook as I set down the phone. This was my son, the boy Harold had taught to fish, who'd sat on his father's shoulders at parades, who'd promised to make us proud. And he wanted to delay his father's funeral for a party. The phone rang immediately. I didn't answer. It rang again. And again. Finally, a text. Mom, you're being emotional. Let's discuss this rationally. Rationally. There was nothing rational about choosing wine over your father's funeral. Nothing rational about the child we'd loved more than life itself, treating Harold's death as an inconvenience to be scheduled around social events. I turned off my phone and made the funeral arrangements alone. Harold would be buried beside his parents in the Harbor Point Cemetery, overlooking the sea he'd loved, with or without his son. I spent the next 2 days in a fog of funeral preparations and simmering anger. The Harbor Point community rallied around me as they always did in times of crisis. Mrs. Patterson brought casseroles, Captain Murphy offered his boat for a sea memorial, and the church ladies organized the reception. Everyone asked about Thomas. "When's he arriving?" they'd say gently. I'd simply reply, "He has obligations," and watch their faces carefully arrange themselves into neutral expressions. Sunday night, alone in my empty house, I made a decision. I called Marcus Bradley, the lawyer who'd handled our affairs for 20 years. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "I need to change my will. Can you see me first thing tomorrow?" "Eleanor, I'm so sorry about Harold." "Of course, but are you sure this is the right time?" "You're grieving." "My mind has never been clearer," I interrupted. 9 o'clock? Monday morning, the day of Harold's funeral. I sat in Marcus's office and systematically disinherited my son. The modest savings Harold and I had accumulated. The house we'd lovingly restored. The small life insurance policy. All of it would go elsewhere. Half to the Harbor Point Maritime Museum, where Harold had volunteered. A quarter to the library where I'd worked. And the final quarter to establish a scholarship fund for local kids pursuing trade skills. "Not a penny to Thomas?" Marcus asked carefully, his pen hovering over the papers. "Not a penny," I confirmed. "If he can't make time for his father's funeral, he doesn't need his father's money." Marcus had me speak to his partner doctor, Sarah Hendricks, who happened to be in the building. She was a psychiatrist who often consulted on competency issues. After a 30-minute conversation, she confirmed what I already knew. I was grieving but completely sound of mind. The papers were drawn up, witnessed, and filed within an hour. I arrived at St. Mary's at 10:30 to find it already filling with mourners. Harold's co-workers from the shipyard, fellow veterans from the VFW, neighbours, friends, all come to honour a good man. The funeral director approached nervously. "Mrs. Whitfield, we have 5 pallbearers, but we need 6. Will your son—" "My son won't be attending," I said firmly. "Ask Robert Patterson. He and Harold served together in Vietnam." The service was beautiful. Pastor William spoke about Harold's dedication to family and community, his quiet strength, his generous spirit. People shared stories. How Harold had fixed their roof after a storm and refused payment. How he'd mentored young workers at the shipyard. How he'd never missed one of Thomas's Little League games. That last memory, shared by Coach Anderson, nearly broke me. The father who'd never missed a game had a son who couldn't attend his funeral. We buried Harold as the fog rolled in from the sea, the mournful cry of the lighthouse horn serving as a final salute. I stood at the graveside, accepting condolences, deflecting questions about Thomas with practiced phrases. He was unable to make it. Prior commitments. He's devastated, of course. Lies to protect the reputation of a son who didn't deserve protection. The reception was held in the church hall, the same space where Harold and I had celebrated our wedding reception decades ago. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting sympathy while my phone buzzed incessantly in my purse. Thomas, no doubt, calling to explain or excuse or negotiate. I never checked. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat in Harold's workshop. His tools hung neatly on the pegboard, each in its designated spot. The half-restored sailboat sat on sawhorses, waiting for hands that would never finish the job. I ran my fingers over the smooth wood Harold had been sanding and made myself a promise. Thomas would learn that some choices have permanent consequences. Thomas arrived 3 days after the funeral, unannounced and indignant. I was kneeling in the garden, planting the flowers Harold had started from seed, when I heard the rental car pull up. He stepped out, looking every inch the successful Manhattan banker, tailored suit, Italian shoes, expression of practiced concern. "Mom," he said, approaching slowly like I was a wild animal that might bolt. "We need to talk." I continued planting, not looking up. "Do we? Seems like you said everything that mattered when you chose a wine tasting over your father's funeral." "That's not fair. I tried to find a compromise." "Compromise?" I stood, soil still clinging to my hands. "Your father's funeral wasn't a business negotiation, Thomas. Though I suppose everything is to you now." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I came as soon as I could. Vivian understood." "Did she? How magnanimous of her to allow you to visit your widowed mother." We stood facing each other across Harold's garden, the distance between us far more than physical. Thomas looked older, harder. The laugh lines around his eyes had been replaced by the permanent furrow of someone always calculating the angles. "Can we go inside?" he asked. "Talk properly?" I led him to the kitchen, deliberately not offering coffee or tea. The hospitality that had always flowed freely in this house had its limits. Thomas sat at the table where he'd done homework, eaten thousands of meals, learned what we'd thought were good values. "I know you're angry," he began, in what I recognized as his business voice. "But shutting me out isn't the answer. We're family." "Are we?" I asked. "Because family shows up, Thomas. Family doesn't pencil in funerals around social calendars. I've apologized for that. What more do you want? I want the son we raised, the boy who helped his father fix boats and read stories at the library with me. Where is that person? Thomas shifted impatiently. People grow up, Mom. They change. They build lives. You built a life on quicksand, I said. All money and status, and keeping the right people happy. Your father lay dying for a year, and you couldn't spare us a weekend. Then he died, and you couldn't even give him a Monday. It's more complicated than that. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The expectations. Vivian's family. Stop. I held up my hand. Don't blame this on Vivian or her family or your job. You made choices. Own them. He leaned back, studying me with those calculating eyes. Is this about money? Because if you need help with the funeral expenses or the house... I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised us both. You think I want your money? The money that's more important than your father's memory? Then what do you want? I want you to understand what you've become, and what you've lost. Thomas stayed for 2 hours, alternating between justification, accusation, and attempts at reconciliation. He pulled out his phone repeatedly, checking messages, taking calls. Even in his grief, if he felt any, he couldn't disconnect from his other life. I have to get back, he finally said. Big meeting tomorrow, but I'll visit more, I promise. We can work through this. No, I said simply. We can't. He left as the sun set, his rental car disappearing down the road that had once brought him home from school every day. I stood at the window, watching until the taillights vanished, then went to Harold's chair and finally let myself cry. The next morning, I had Marcus send Thomas a formal copy of the will changes. It was time he understood that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with promises and good intentions. The registered letter reached Thomas a week later. Marcus called to inform me it had been signed for and delivered. 20 minutes after that, my phone exploded with calls and texts. I turned it off and went for a walk along the harbour, needing the sea air to steady my nerves. When I returned home, there were 17 voicemails. I deleted them without listening. But I did read the one email Thomas sent, filled with capital letters and legal threats. You can't do this. Undue influence. Mental incompetence. My lawyers will contest this. Let him try, I thought. Marcus had been thorough. What I didn't expect was Vivian's call the next day. She never called me directly, preferring to communicate through Thomas. Her voice was ice-cold fury barely contained. Eleanor, what have you done? Protected my husband's legacy from people who didn't value him, I replied calmly. That money is Thomas's birthright. You have no right. I have every right. It was our money, Harold's and mine, earned through honest work and careful saving. Not inherited, not given. Earned. Something you might not understand. We were counting on that money, she said, dropping all pretense. We have plans, investments lined up. You're destroying our future. There it was. The truth laid bare. They'd been spending Harold's money in their minds while he was still struggling to breathe. Then perhaps you should have valued Harold's life as much as his death benefit, I said and hung up. The harassment escalated over the next month. Daily calls from different numbers. Legal letters threatening action. Thomas even sent some banking executive friend to mediate, a slick man who spoke of family reconciliation while his eyes catalogued our possessions. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The calls, the threats, the pressure, everything went quiet. I learned why from Margaret Chen, who worked at the Portland newspaper and still had connections in financial circles. "Word is your son's in trouble," she told me over coffee. Made some risky investments, assuming he had family money coming. When that fell through, he couldn't cover. Had to liquidate assets, sell the fancy apartment. His wife's family is furious. I felt no satisfaction hearing this, only sadness. Harold would have been heartbroken to know his son had gambled on his death. 2 months after the funeral, I received a different kind of letter. Handwritten on plain paper, no legal letterhead or formal language. "Mom," it began. "Vivian left me. Her family cut us off when the investments failed. I'm living in a studio in Queens, working at a smaller firm. I've lost everything. Are you happy now?" Was I happy? I sat at Harold's desk, reading my son's words. No, I wasn't happy, but I was resolved. He'd lost everything, he said, but he'd lost it all long before the money disappeared. He'd lost it when he chose networking over family dinners, status over substance, his wife's approval over his father's last goodbye. I wrote back, my first communication since the funeral. "Thomas, you haven't lost everything. You've lost things. Apartments, status, a wife who measured your worth in dollars. What you lost long ago was your sense of what matters. Your father's death didn't cause your problems. Your choices did. When you understand that, perhaps you'll begin to find what you really lost." Mom, I mailed it without knowing if he'd receive it, if he'd read it, if he'd understand it. But I'd said what needed saying. The rest was up to him. That night, I found Harold's journal in his workshop drawer. The last entry, dated a week before his death, read, "I hope Thomas finds his way back. Not to us, it's too late for that, but back to himself. The boy we raised is still in there somewhere. I have to believe that." So did I. 6 months passed before I heard from Thomas again. Not a call or email, but a knock on my door on a rainy October evening. I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the expensive suit, the styled hair, the constant phone in hand. He stood on my porch in jeans and a flannel shirt, soaking wet, looking more like the boy who'd left for college than the man he'd become. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. No demands, no assumptions. A request. I stepped aside and let him enter. He removed his wet boots carefully at the door, something he hadn't done in years, always too important to remember small courtesies. In the kitchen, I made tea while he sat at the table, running his fingers over the worn wood. "I've been working," he said finally. "Teaching. Financial literacy at a community center in Queens. The pay is..." He laughed, a sound without humor. "Well, Vivian would call it insulting. But the people I help, they remind me of Mr. Morrison from the hardware store. Remember him? Always worried about making ends meet." I remembered. Harold had helped Mr. Morrison with his taxes every year free of charge. "Your father respected people who worked hard, regardless of their bank balance," I said. I'd forgotten that. Forgotten a lot of things. Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "After Vivian left, I was angry. At you, at her, at the world. I spent weeks plotting how to get the money, the life, everything back. Then one night, I found an old photo in my wallet. Dad and me on his boat. The summer before college." He pulled out the photo, weathered and creased. Harold beamed at the camera, his arm around a younger Thomas who looked equally happy. Both were sunburned, holding fishing rods, completely at ease with each other and the world. I stared at that photo and couldn't remember the last time I'd been that happy. Really happy, not just successful or impressive or whatever I thought mattered. And I realized I'd become someone Dad wouldn't recognize. Someone I don't recognize. We sat in silence, rain pattering against the windows. The grandfather clock Harold had restored ticked steadily in the hallway. Finally, Thomas spoke again. I went to his grave last week. First time since, well, I told him about the teaching. About how I'm living simply now, cooking my own meals, taking the subway. Things that would have horrified me a year ago, but feel right, normal, like coming home to myself. And Vivian? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Remarried already. Some tech executive her parents approved of. I heard through mutual friends. They're already planning which private schools their future children will attend. He shook his head. I actually felt sorry for her. She'll never know what it's like to be valued for yourself, not your portfolio. Thomas stayed for dinner. We ate Harold's favorite pot roast, and he helped wash dishes without being asked. He told me about his students, immigrants and single mothers and elderly people trying to understand modern banking. His eyes lit up when he described their victories, their gratitude, their determination. There's this one woman, Mrs. Rodriguez. She reminds me of you. 3 jobs raising grandkids, and she still makes time to learn about budgeting so she can save for their education. Last week, she brought me tamales because I'd stayed late to help her understand compound interest. He smiled. Best payment I've ever received. Before he left, we stood in Harold's workshop. Thomas ran his hands over the unfinished sailboat. Would it be okay if... Could I try to finish this? I remember some of what Dad taught me. I'd have to come up on weekends, learn the rest as I go. Your father would like that, I said, my voice thick. We established a pattern. Thomas came every other weekend, staying in his old room, working on the boat. We didn't talk about the will or the money. Instead, we talked about his students, about Harold's techniques, about the town and its changes. Slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding what had been broken. I revised my will again that Christmas, not to restore Thomas's full inheritance. That lesson needed to stand, but to ensure he'd have enough to continue his father's work, to keep teaching, to help others the way Harold always had. The rest still went to the community organizations, because Harold believed in lifting up the whole town, not just his own. 2 years later, I stood in St. Mary's again, this time for a happier occasion. Thomas married Emma in a simple ceremony, surrounded by the community that had welcomed him home. As he spoke his vows, I heard echoes of the boy we'd raised. Sincere, humble, committed to something larger than himself. Now I sit on the same porch where Harold and I dreamed of our future, where we watched Thomas grow, where everything fell apart and slowly came back together. Thomas and Emma are expected a year after Harold's death. On a crisp April morning, we launched the sailboat he'd never finished. Thomas had spent months completing it, his hands growing calloused, his skills improving with each visit. The whole town turned out for the launch, as they had for Harold's funeral. But this time, Thomas stood beside me, present in every sense of the word. Dad would have loved this, he said as the boat slipped into the water, christened Harold's Dream in navy blue letters. Captain Murphy had volunteered to sail her out for the maiden voyage, and we watched from the dock as the white sails caught the wind. He would have loved having you here more, I said gently. Thomas nodded. No defensiveness now, just acceptance of truth spoken with love. That evening, as we cleaned up from the launch celebration, Thomas handed me an envelope. "It's not about money," he said quickly. "Just read it." I opened it to find a handwritten letter. "Mum, this past year has taught me more than the previous decade. I learned that wealth isn't measured in portfolios, but in people who show up when life gets hard. That success isn't about impressive titles, but about making a difference in someone's life. That family isn't an obligation to schedule around, but the foundation everything else is built on. I can't undo my choices. I can't give Dad the goodbye he deserved, or you the support you needed. But I can promise to be the man you both raised me to be, starting now. I've applied to teach at Harbour Point Community College. If they'll have me, I want to come home. Not for an inheritance. I know that ship has sailed, and rightly so. But because this is where I belong. Where I can honor Dad's memory by living the values he taught me. Your son, and I hope to earn that title again. Thomas." I set the letter down with trembling hands. Through the window, I could see Harold's workshop, the empty sawhorses where the boat had sat, the tools still hanging in their places. Above them, Thomas had mounted a new sign. Harold Whitfield and Son, Boat Restoration. "The college would be lucky to have you," I said. "And the town needs young people who understand what really matters." Thomas moved back that August, renting a small apartment near the harbour. He taught economics at the community college, but his real passion became financial literacy programs for fishing families and elderly residents. He started dating Emma Morrison, the hardware store owner's daughter who'd become a nurse, a girl who understood choosing purpose over profit. I revised my will again that Christmas, not to restore Thomas's full inheritance. That lesson needed to stand, but to ensure he'd have enough to continue his father's work, to keep teaching, to help others the way Harold always had. The rest still went to the community organizations, because Harold believed in lifting up the whole town, not just his own. 2 years later, I stood in St. Mary's again, this time for a happier occasion. Thomas married Emma in a simple ceremony, surrounded by the community that had welcomed him home. As he spoke his vows, I heard echoes of the boy we'd raised, sincere, humble, committed to something larger than himself. Now I sit on the same porch where Harold and I dreamed of our future, where we watched Thomas grow, where everything fell apart and slowly came back together. Thomas and Emma are expecting their first child. They plan to name him Harold if it's a boy, Hope if it's a girl. Either way, the child will grow up in Harbour Point, surrounded by people who understand that love isn't measured in dollars but in presence. Some might say I was too harsh, cutting Thomas off completely. But sometimes love requires hard choices. Sometimes a mother must risk losing her child to save him from himself. Harold knew that. In his final journal entry, he'd written about hoping Thomas would find his way back. Not to us, but to himself. He found both. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the harbour as evening falls, a constant reminder that even in the darkest storms, there's always a light guiding us home. Thomas needed to lose everything to find what truly mattered. And perhaps I needed to let him go completely before he could truly return. That's the thing about family. It's not the blood or the money or the obligations that bind us. It's the choice to show up, to stay, to do the hard work of loving each other through failures and forgiveness. Thomas chose Vivian's birthday over Harold's funeral, yes. But then he chose to come back, to change, to become the man his father always believed he could be. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that really matters.